Hi everyone, so it's time to wrap up our notes on evolution. So I want you to go ahead and make sure that as you take these notes that you're following along on your worksheet and that you're filling in the information as we go, okay? So we've talked a lot this unit about how evolution is the change in species over time, and we have been working on what exactly that means through natural selection and how you have to reproduce and survive in order to pass those genes on. So how exactly do things become new species? So let's talk about what speciation means. The definition of speciation is the formation of a new species over time. Okay, so make sure you have that down. Formation of a new species over time. So it's when you get two separate species that used to be one. Okay, so we've diverged somewhere. So now there's a common ancestor. So there's two ways that speciation is maintained throughout the environment. And one way is through what's called a pre-zygotic barrier, and the second way is through a post-zygotic barrier. So pre-zygotic barriers mean that the barriers occur before fertilization. So there is no possibility of two new organisms or two new species forming because fertilization has occurred. Sperm does not fertilize the egg. Post-zygotic barriers means that the egg has been fused together, but for some reason the organisms don't develop. So there's different ways that that happens, and we'll talk about each of those. So on your sheet, you'll see that you have them all listed. So the pre-zygotic barriers, there's 4 of them that we're going to talk about. Make sure that you write the definition down as well, okay? So the first one being geographic. Geographic means that they don't live in the same place. So there's no chance that they're going to meet because they don't live together. Okay, so that's the first one. So that's also called habitat isolation. You might want to write that down as well. So geographic is the same thing as habitat. They don't live in the same place. Like in this example here, this snake lives in the water and this snake lives on the land. So they'll never come in contact with each other, so they're not going to reproduce. They're 2 different species of snakes. The next one is temporal, and temporal refers to time, and so that means that they reproduce at different times of the year or different times of day. So it can be that one reproduces, let's say that this one reproduces in the spring and this species reproduces in the fall. So since they don't reproduce at the same time, they would never be able to reproduce together. It can also be times of day, so some reproduce in the morning, some at night, whatever. It just has to be that they're reproducing at different times. The next pre-zygotic barrier is called behavioral isolation. Behavioral isolation means that they have different rituals. So they do songs or dances for each other, and if you're not doing the right one, then they're not going to be interested and you're not going to get a mate. So there's all kinds of different bird calls and things like that that would apply to. And then the last one is mechanical isolation. And mechanical isolation means that they are attempting to mate, however, the parts don't quite fit together, or they don't match up correctly, so they cannot actually reproduce. So that's why species remain separate. Okay, so those are the 4 that we have: geographic, temporal, behavioral, and mechanical. And remember that geographic is the same thing as habitat. So keeping species separate from one another. The other type means that fertilization has occurred. So we have a zygote formed, but something else is happening. So there's 3 of these. So we have hybrid inviability. So hybrid means that you have 2 different species come together to try and form one species. Reduced hybrid viability, or hybrid inviability, like it's written on your sheet, means that there's a miscarriage. So the baby is never born, it dies. Okay, so the baby dies before it is even born. So that's hybrid inviability. That's the first type. The second type is hybrid sterility. Hybrid sterility means that the 2 parents mate and they get an offspring, but the offspring cannot reproduce. And that's how we get mules. So you have a horse and a donkey come together and produce a mule. The only way you get mules is from horses and donkeys reproducing. Mules can't make other mules. So that's called reduced hybrid fertility because mules are sterile. And then hybrid breakdown is kind of the same thing, but it's 1 generation later. So the 2 parents reproduce they get offspring, their offspring can reproduce, but then the next generation cannot reproduce. So it's called a breakdown because it breaks down further down in the generation lines. Okay, so those are the types of barriers that keep species separate from one another. So let's talk about these patterns of speciation that exist. And you have 3 graphs on your notes that you should be referring to during this. So the first pattern is called directional selection. And directional selection is, so normally we have this normal bell distribution where if we're talking about like beaks, you have small beaks, medium beaks, and large beaks. And then if there's an environmental change or something happens, there's some sort of natural disaster or they migrated to a new place, then you're going to have different beaks be favored. So now in this case, the large beaks are now favored. So you have more large beaks than you do medium beaks. So it is shifted. It's called directional. It is moved in either one direction or it could have moved to the small beaks direction. It just depends. But in either case, it is shifted. The next one is called disruptive. Disruptive selection means that the extreme values are favored over the intermediate. So it's the same thing. The original graph starts off the same. We have small beaks, we have medium beaks, and we have large beaks. But now for some reason, something happened in the environment where the organisms with the medium beaks are not surviving. So it's divided it into 2 groups. So you have a group with small beaks, and you have a group with large beaks, and you have very few with medium beaks. Okay, so that's disruptive because you're disrupting the curve. And then the third one is called stabilizing. And stabilizing decreases genetic diversity. The other 2 are changing or shifting the genetic diversity. Stabilizing decreases the diversity. And instead of having small, medium, and large, if this is your original graph, you had small, medium, and large. Now you have almost all of them being medium. So you have very little diversity, very little variation in that group. So the middle value is selected for, the extremes are selected against. Okay, so that is it for speciation. I have a practice worksheet that you need to complete, so make sure that you do that. And if you have any questions, you should jot them down at the bottom of your page, and we'll go over them in class. Okay, thanks.